Hello everyone, this is Island Nurse and welcome to my YouTube channel. Now this video is the first in a series where we'll be discussing nursing management for brain disorders. However, before we delve into the disorders, it's important for us to briefly review brain anatomy and physiology. So we have a diagram here which is a cross section of the brain, and of course we're looking at the medial aspect. So let's start by labeling our diagram and we'll work our way around. So the outer portion or the biggest area of the brain that is in brown is known as the cerebrum. You may also hear it referred to as the cerebral cortex. However, the cerebral cortex is really the outer layer of the cerebrum that contains gray matter, and the cerebrum is composed mainly of white matter. So let's label the cerebral cortex then. Okay, and this area that we're looking at that's in dark brown, that is going to be our corpus callosum. Okay, great. Just underneath the corpus callosum, this area that we're looking at in red is going to be our thalamus. And very close to the thalamus, if you can see clearly, there's a little area in white, and that's going to be the pineal gland, or pineal gland if you prefer the pronunciation. Now, the pineal gland is actually part of the epithalamus, but for our purposes, we're just going to focus on the gland itself and not the entire epithalamus. Okay, so if you notice this beautiful strawberry looking structure, and of course, that is our cerebellum. All right, great. All right, so this entire structure in green, the entire structure is called the brainstem. Okay, and of course, the brainstem consists of three aspects. So right here in the center, we have the midbrain. And the inferior aspect is known as the medulla oblongata. And the middle portion is the pons. I'll just put the brainstem in parentheses. Okay, and above the pons, there's this little area in white, and that's going to be our pituitary gland. I'll do that again. All right, so we're looking at this area in white, pituitary. All right, great. That's our pituitary gland. And finally, the final structure that we're going to look at is this area in purple, and that is going to be our hypothalamus. So I'll just put a line here. Hypothalamus. All right, great. So there you have it. These are the major segments of the brain that we're going to discuss today. All right, so let's begin with the cerebrum. Of course, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and the cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes, and we will delve more into that in the following video. So the cerebrum is responsible for what we might term as higher order functionings. So functions such as thinking, learning, memory, and interpretation of data, those are the responsibilities of the cerebrum. And of course, remember I said the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum. So sometimes you would hear them being used interchangeably. Next, we're going to look at the corpus callosum. So what is the function of the corpus callosum? Alright, so the corpus callosum is fibrous tissue that contains approximately 200 million axons. And the function of the corpus callosum is to connect the left hemisphere of the brain to the right hemisphere. So the corpus callosum ensures communication between both hemispheres. And it is also said to have some function in our consciousness and alertness. Alright, let's look at our thalamus now. Very important. Well, I mean, they all are important, but the thalamus is like the bridge between the brainstem and the cerebrum and other parts of the brain. So we can say that the thalamus really, the function of the thalamus is to act as a bridge or to filter information that comes in via the brainstem on its way to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so let us remember that in our environment we take in a lot of information via our sense organs all of the time. There's information coming visually to our eyes, auditory through our ears, we have tactile information, we have information coming through our nostrils, things that we inhale, sounds that we hear. However, we don't need all of this information, right? If the brain were to attempt to process all of this information, it would be too much. It would be like information overload. We would just go crazy. So one of the functions of the thalamus is to determine which types of information are important, which types of information are meaningful, and to filter that information. So information that's coming to us from the environment, the thalamus determines whether we need the information, and if we don't need the information, the thalamus is not going to send that information on to the cerebrum. However, if the thalamus gets a signal that this is important information, the second function of the thalamus is to take that information and to send it to the different parts of the cerebrum. The thalamus determines what information should go to which portion or which lobe of the cerebrum. For instance, we all know that the occipital lobe of the cerebrum is responsible for interpreting visual data. So when we get information coming to our eyes, when we see an object, that information comes up the brainstem, it goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus determines that this is visual information, so the thalamus sends that information to the occipital lobe of the brain, and then we're able to recognize an object and determine what it is. Of course, this all happens in a split second. Okay, so now let's look at the pineal gland, and there's still a lot of discussion in the scientific community about the pineal gland and melatonin, which is the hormone that it produces. So the pineal gland produces the hormone, like I just mentioned, called melatonin, which is not to be confused with melanin, which gives us our pigment. This hormone is said to be involved with our sleep-wake cycle. So what research has shown is that melatonin secretion increases greatly during the darker hours of the day, so during the night, and during the day or during the hours of light, the daylight hours, melatonin secretion is decreased. So this is why it is thought that as human beings, we tend to sleep during the night and we're more awake and alert during the day. Okay, so next we'll move on to the cerebellum. As you see the nice strawberry looking structure there. And the cerebellum is involved with balance and coordination. So if I were to attempt to stand on one leg, the cerebellum would be responsible for that. It's responsible for giving us smooth muscle movements, and it's also responsible for activities that require fine-tuning. So learning to ride a bike, for instance, where we have to use up a lot of our muscle groups, the cerebellum is responsible for that. So let's focus now on the brainstem. And of course, like I said, the brainstem is divided into three aspects: the midbrain, the medulla oblongata, and the pons. And they each have different functions. They each have specific functions, but we're going to talk about the brainstem as a whole. So the brainstem is the part of the nervous system that is continuous with the spinal cord. It's at the back of the neck, and it gives rise to cranial nerves 3 to 12. Now, the brainstem is responsible for a lot of the autonomic physiological functions of our body. So it will be responsible for maintaining our heart rate, our blood pressure, our respiration, and even digestion. Now, the brainstem has what we call pathways, okay? And these pathways travel up and down. So the ascending pathways, which are the ones that go up, take sensory information to the other parts of the brain, okay? So it will take sensory information to the thalamus, like we said before, and then the thalamus determines if this information is useful or not, and then the thalamus would decide what part of the brain to send it to. And the brainstem also has descending pathways, and the descending pathways send motor information to the rest of our body and innervates motor neurons. So, as an example of how information would travel from the brainstem to the thalamus and to the cerebrum. Let's say, for example, you're riding in a bus from your job to your house. You're sitting in the bus, you're sitting at a window, and you're looking out of the window. When you get to your destination, suppose I were to ask you, how many elderly people did you see cross the street? Or how many garbage bins did you see along the road? Or did you notice if there was a white house with a red roof? Of course, you may say something like, okay, I don't know, I wasn't paying attention. Now, in your mind, you might think that that's a voluntary process, but not quite. What is actually happening is that the sensory information, remember, information from our sense organs, so from our eyes, from our ears, right? Information enters here, the brainstem, and it goes to the thalamus. Now, because the information is not meaningful to you, the thalamus receives that signal that the information is not meaningful, it's not purposeful. So the thalamus decides that rather than sending the information onto the cerebrum, it's not going to do anything with the information. Hence the reason you would not remember what you saw while you're traveling, right? Because the thalamus received the signal that that information was not meaningful. However, if the information was meaningful to you, let's say, for instance, you were involved in an environmental project, and part of the project is for you to count garbage bins along the side of the street, then the information becomes meaningful, right? So when that information traverses the brainstem up to the thalamus receives a signal that, hey, this information is meaningful, and then the thalamus would then send that information to the cerebrum, to whichever area of the brain is responsible for processing that information. Okay, I know I backtracked a little bit to talk about the thalamus, but I just wanted you to see the connection between the thalamus and the brainstem. All right, so let's focus now on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So if you notice, they are close to each other and they actually work nicely together. So a lot of the hormones that we need in our bodies are actually produced in the hypothalamus, and they're stored in other glands of the body. Okay, so one of these glands is the pituitary gland. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're just going to focus on the posterior pituitary gland, because the anterior pituitary gland is connected to the brain via tiny blood vessels, but the posterior pituitary gland, which is what we're seeing here, is what is actually part of the brain. So the posterior pituitary gland secretes, and by secrete I mean that it releases these hormones into the bloodstream. Remember, the hypothalamus produces the hormones, and this gland secretes or releases those hormones into the bloodstream with instruction from the brain. So the two hormones that are secreted by the pituitary gland are vasopressin and oxytocin. Alright, so let's talk about these two hormones for a little bit. So vasopressin is your antidiuretic hormone. So that is a hormone that will be responsible for retaining water in your body if you're dehydrated. And oxytocin is a hormone that is responsible for stimulating the release of breast milk during lactation, and it's also responsible for uterine contractions during labor and delivery. Alright, so the hypothalamus, like we said, the hypothalamus produces a lot of the hormones, but the hypothalamus is also responsible for regulating body temperature, very importantly, and also for regulating fatigue. And it's also responsible for regulating a lot of the metabolic processes of the body. So it is thought to be the link between the brain and the endocrine system. So there you have it. We have briefly discussed the functions of the major portions of the brain, and in our next video we will focus specifically on the cerebrum, because like I said, the cerebrum is the largest area of the brain that contains 4 lobes, which each have specific responsibilities. So in the next video we will go over those in depth. Again, I want to thank you for looking at this video. If you found this information useful, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.